Очень рада приветствовать всех у нас сегодня. С большой радостью и трепетом я бы хотела представить вам доктора Роджера Идеиши, который приехал к нам специально из Университета Темпл, из Филадельфии. Роджер Идеиши фокусируется на изучении тем, связанных с социализацией людей с аутизмом и особенностями развития, в том числе посредством соприкосновения с искусством и с коллекцией музейной. Мне посчастливилось побывать на лекции доктора Идеиши во время конференции, посвященной лучшим проектам в области доступной среды в Атланте в прошлом году. И я могу сказать, что это была огромная сенсация, потому что люди покидали другие доклады и бежали, чтобы послушать Роджера Идеиши и взять у него автограф. То есть это ученый-звезда, к которому были просто огромные очереди. Для нас большая радость, что именно в Пушкинском музее проходит первая встреча с Роджером в России. Его доклад будет посвящен теме взаимодействия с искусством детей и взрослых с расстройством аутистического спектра и другими особенностями развития. И мы приглашаем вас в конце лекции задать свои вопросы. Роджер будет очень рад на них ответить. Спасибо.
Thank you, Evgenia, and thank you for having me here at the Pushkin State Museum. I'm really glad to share what I have learned over the last 15 years working with children and youth with autism and intellectual disabilities, mostly looking at how people with neurodevelopmental disabilities can participate in the community much more. So I'm from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It's the 5th largest city in the United States. We're mostly famous for Rocky movie on the steps of our art museum. And Philadelphia is a wonderful environment for me to do the work that I do, trying to bring arts integration for people with neurodevelopmental disabilities. We have wonderful music and dance and museums and theater. So it's been a really wonderful environment where the arts organizations are the most welcoming and inviting for people with disabilities. So today I want to talk about my experience and the perspective that I use in creating this integration between arts and disability, particularly for those with neurodevelopmental disabilities. And I think one of the most important things that people don't understand is what I would refer to as sensory processing. And I'm going to talk about sensory processing in a little bit. I've collected some research, although there isn't that much research available, and I want to talk about that. And also just talk about some basic structure that I use in creating the kinds of programs that I've worked on. So let's first begin with what are the rules and expectations in a museum or in a theater? And most of the rules are don't touch, don't talk, don't move too much, right? And there's a lot of no's, don't do this. For people with neurodevelopmental disabilities, these rules might be difficult to follow. And even how do you learn those rules? How did you learn the rule that you aren't supposed to touch things in a museum or that you're not supposed to talk in a theater? Nobody really teaches you those explicitly. Your parent may say, shh, or your parent may say, don't touch. But it's not like it's given to you as the rule is. And there's lots of rules in society that aren't always told to us. And those who have neurodevelopmental disabilities often have a difficult time understanding these rules that come out of thin air. So the way that I frame arts accessibility is that access is really just the beginning point. Access just means you're getting in the door. but what happens after you're in the door? That for people with neurodevelopmental disabilities, people who have sensory processing disorder or cognitive processing disorder, that there's a different process that the person may use in taking the information in around the environment. And so there has to be this meaningful connection with the content of the experience, whether it's a museum or a theater. And for some people, they have to be participating in the experience. It's not enough to just passively walk through the museum and just look at the artifacts. There has to be some different type of engagement sometimes that allows them to understand what a statue is, or what a painting is, or what a ballet is. And through that process, going out into the community is about connecting with other people so that you learn about the world around you. And then ultimately, the goal is inclusion, that the person has choices and opportunities all the time, not just some of the time, but all the time. So the work in arts accessibility at this point in time is really just about getting in the door. And I think those of us who are working in the arts accessibility world, we're trying to create more opportunities with participation and connecting, and hopefully aspiring for full inclusion in society. So going out into the community is really difficult for most people, including me. This is my first time in Moscow, and when you go to a new place, oftentimes you get very anxious. So I was very anxious coming to Moscow for the first time. I wasn't certain what to expect, and I was reading as much as I could about Moscow, about how do I get from the airport to the city, where is the hotel, and is it close to other things? I was preparing as much as I can so that I can predict and understand what was going to happen to me when I arrived here. I even was looking up the museum here and looking at whatever they had online with the museum. So going into the community or going outside of your home, there's lots of things that are happening. And there's lights and sounds and crowds, and there's lots of information that I have to take in, whether it's visually or auditorily. I have to take all that information in. And I have to figure out a way to manage myself so that I can get the most out of this experience as I can. And so it comes back to this idea of predictability. You know, as I was preparing for this trip, I read about Moscow. I was reading the history of Russia. I was reading about the Pushkin Museum. I was reading as much as I possibly could. So I was familiar. When you don't know about something, right, when it's not predictable and it's unfamiliar, you get more anxious. So knowing about the environment is really important. One of the ways that I think about someone who has a neurodevelopmental disability is how they take the information in. And how do you take information in? Through your eyes, your ears, through touching, tasting, smelling, right? For many people with neurodevelopmental disabilities, they take information in across this continuum, right? Most people sort of fall somewhere in the middle, and we can predict and be familiar with what the sensation is. But for some people with neurodevelopmental disabilities, they may be hypersensitive to the sensations around them, or they might be hyposensitive to the sensations around them. Hypersensitivity means that they actually experience the sensation much more than most other people. Hyposensitivity means that they experience the sensation a little bit less than most other people. So, in thinking about what happens when you go out into the community, there's lots of challenges. So there's the sensory challenges. But in my discussions with families, and this is mostly from the United States, I've also gathered a little bit of information from the UK and Romania and Ireland. but mostly from the United States. One of the biggest barriers is really social. That when a family who has a child with a disability goes out into the public, that they're often ridiculed by other people in society. And these are strangers, strangers that come up to the family member or the parent and will actually say things like, "You're a bad parent," or that your child is bad because your child is responding to the world in a way that I don't understand, and so therefore your child must be bad. And so families are telling me this all the time. So families don't feel comfortable going out into the community, even though they want to go out into the community. They want to have a normal family life. But because of the way the public treats them, they choose to stay home, and they choose to isolate themselves. In the United States, the statistics around neurodevelopmental disabilities are that there's a higher rate of obesity among people with neurodevelopmental disabilities because they're at home and they don't have as much physical activity. There's also higher rates of depression because they are at home and they're socially isolated. So going out into the community actually is really important. It makes them more physically active, and it gives them opportunities to interact with other people and learn the social skills for being out in society. So the work that I do is really focused on really trying to improve not the person who has the disability. My work is mostly focused on improving society. So family members often ask, when they go out into the community, they're afraid that other people are going to judge them. They're afraid if their child misbehaves or has a meltdown. They're afraid how their child is interacting with other people, that people aren't going to understand, and that are they a burden to other people? So coming to the museum and you're bringing your child who has autism, and your child may respond to the artifacts in a very different way. Families are often afraid that, well, I'm upsetting other people, right? The other thing that families often tell me is, we don't even trust the museum. We don't trust the ballet company. We don't trust the theater. We don't trust these places to know what they're doing because a museum doesn't inherently understand about disability. Maybe a school will understand about disability, but a museum, how would they know about disability? And so the families are telling me they don't even trust going to the museum. Even if the museum says they have an accessible program, the family wants to know that there was training. They want to know that the staff knows what they're doing, that their staff understands disability, their staff understands my family. And they want to know that the museum's going to help them. So there's a lot of social barriers that need to be overcome in order to create accessible programming. So for those with neurodevelopmental disabilities, the work that I do is primarily focused on those with sensory processing disorder. So they take in information differently. Many people think that those with sensory processing disorder, that they process slower. So someone who has autism or someone who has an intellectual disability, that they process slower. And for some people, that's true, but it's not true for most of them. Some of them process slower, but others, it really is just about processing differently. And I'm going to talk about some of the ways that we can think about how people process differently. So one of the first ways I think about it is, first you have to get the information. Well, where do we get the information from? Our eyes, our ears, touching, smelling, tasting, right? 5 senses. That's where we get the information from, right? Is that true? Everybody agrees, right? Well, there's actually 8 other types of sensations where we gather information from, And these 8 other sensations are all related to movement. And the terms that are used are called proprioception, kinesthesia, and vestibular. And those sensations come from our muscles, they come from our joints. There's actually a little part in our ear that tells us about how we orient ourselves in space. It has nothing to do with hearing, even though it's in our ear, but it gives us a sense of space and movement. Well, the sensation of movement really comes from gravity. Gravity is what? Falling down to the ground, right? So if you think back to what I said just a few minutes ago about hypersensitive and hyposensitive, hypersensitive means they experience the sensation more than other people. So experiencing gravity more than everybody else means you feel like you're falling down more than everybody else. If you're hyposensitive, it means you're experiencing the sensation a little bit less than everybody else, which means you actually don't feel gravity quite as much, right? So if you don't feel gravity quite as much, how are you orienting to what space is, or how are you orienting to what your body is doing, right? So think about people who may be experiencing the sensations in that way, right? So there's 8 senses, and that's how we understand the world around us. It's not just the 5. We use movement to actually understand the world also. So hypersensitive and hyposensitive, okay? You have to take the information in, right? So let's just take the movement sensation. You're hypersensitive, you feel gravity more than everybody else, and it's whenever you move. So whenever I raise my arm, whenever I turn my head, whenever I step forward, I feel gravity. Our bodies, or for those of us who don't have a sensory processing disorder, our brain has sort of figured out how to accommodate. And so we don't have to use a lot of energy to think about what gravity feels like. And for most people in society, our brain sort of knows what to do automatically. But for those with sensory processing disorder, any movement that I make makes me feel like I'm falling down, right? So if I raise my arm, right, my body weight shifts to one side, I feel gravity. If I turn my head to one side, my weight shifts to one side as I turn my head, I feel gravity. And if I'm feeling gravity more than everybody else, and that sensation is hypersensitive, then anytime I move, I feel like I'm falling down to the ground. So what would be the typical response? If you felt yourself falling down, what would you do? You'd sort of hold your body tighter, right? Now, that seems normal, right? That's a normal response. If you're feeling gravity, you sort of hold your body tighter. Imagine going through most of your life like that, right? So someone who is hypersensitive to gravity, are they going to move around a lot? Probably not. Are they going to move much more cautiously? Probably, right? So they're not exploring their environment, they're not exploring the world as much as everybody else. If you're hyposensitive to gravity, it means you don't feel gravity as much as everybody else. And when you don't feel gravity, you don't have that same spatial orientation as everybody else. And one of the responses that we often see, or that I often see as a practitioner or therapist, is that when you don't feel gravity or when you don't have spatial orientation, you kind of try to search out the environment and gather as much information as you possibly can, maybe through other means, through vision, through touching, right? So if I'm trying to get a sense of space around me because I don't have that gravitational orientation like everybody else, I might actually touch things a lot more. I might move around the environment a lot more. oftentimes we'll see kids with autism be a little bit more hyperactive, or what seems like they're hyperactive in their behavior, but really their behavior is about exploring the environment because they're trying to get a sense of what the space orientation is. So they may move a lot more. They may explore, they may touch things more than what you would expect from another child. So think about a museum space, right? Don't touch things, and there's big open spaces, and how do I get oriented to this big open space? And then with the sound and the height of the ceiling and the size of this statue, I have to take all that information in and sort of figure out, what does this all mean, right? So I have to receive that information, I have to perceive it in some way, and if I'm perceiving it in a hypersensitive or hyposensitive way, well, my response is going to be different, right? Just like your normal response if you feel like you're falling down, right? We can also apply that same idea to sound or lights or touching. So let's take sound, for example. If you're hypersensitive to sound, you hear sound sensation a little bit more than everybody else. So right now, even though my voice is amplified with this microphone, I'm talking at a normal tone, right? But if you're hypersensitive, meaning you experience the sound more than everybody else, you may actually think that I'm yelling right now, right? But I'm not yelling. Now imagine going through your life thinking everybody's yelling at you because you're hypersensitive to sound, right? So every time I look at you and I talk to you, you feel like I'm yelling at you. Well, what do you then interpret? What do you interpret from that? That I'm yelling at you, or other people are yelling at you all the time. But that's just your way of taking in that information, right? So what would be your normal response when you think people are yelling at you? You'll be like, right? Why is the person yelling at me? Did I do something wrong? Is there something, you're trying to figure out, why is this person always yelling at me, right? So you start to have this different sense of self and identity because you hear things more than everybody else, right? Or if someone is or not even yelling, but we're in this space where with this microphone and with these speakers, the sound is echoing and reverberating around this space. And you hear the sound more than everybody else. And it's a loud sound, so it's like a big horn from a boat that's constantly coming at you with just this little bit of sound and reverberation. So again, think about, what if you went through your life like that, with a big horn blasting in your ear all the time? What would your natural response be? Your natural response would be to withdraw from that sound, right? Or cover your ears. Or if you can't make the sound go away, what do? You start to sort of try and convey that to somebody else. The sound is too much. You cry, you scream, you try to express something, and if you can't express your words, then how are you going to express that you don't like these sounds, because these sounds keep on coming at you and you can't control those sounds, right? You might scream or yell or convey something to let people around you know that the sound is too much for me, right? If you're hyposensitive to sound, meaning you experience the sound sensation a little bit less than other people, then it will sound like I'm whispering all the time, and you can't hear everything. So, what is your natural response when you think someone is whispering or the sounds are really soft? You tend to lean in more, listen more, or you keep on asking questions. What did you say? What did you say? Can you say that again? What did you say? And then you lean in closer again. What did you say? I can't hear you. And you lean in closer. And so my response is a normal response that any of you would do under those conditions. If you can't hear something, what is your normal response? Your normal response is lean in or ask a question again, right? But because that's what I'm experiencing all the time, I'm leaning in more than everybody else. I'm asking more questions than everybody else. And what is your response? If I'm the person who's always leaning in and asking questions, your response to me is, what's wrong with Roger? He keeps on leaning in, or he's too close, or he keeps on asking questions over and over again, and he won't stop, right? And then you start thinking, Roger's very strange, right? So, but my response to that hyposensitive sound that I can't gather all the sensations like everybody else, my natural response is the same natural response that you have. I just may do it more, right? But then this other whole process of you thinking that Roger's strange or what's wrong with Roger, right? It sort of sets up this social barrier between me and everybody else, right? And I feel it, and I know it. I know that people don't want to be near me, right? But it's my only way to gather information is to keep on moving in closer or asking questions over and over again. Otherwise, I'm not a part of something. But people with neurodevelopmental disabilities, they have emotions just like everybody else. And they feel emotions just like you. They know what happiness is, they know what sadness is, they know what loneliness is. Just because they have an intellectual disability doesn't mean that they understand happiness different than everybody else, or that they understand sadness different than everybody else. They understand the emotions just like you and I, right? And so when you think I'm strange, and you treat me as if I'm strange, then I feel it, right? But the way that I'm trying to understand the world, to gather the information from around me, right? My response really isn't any different than your response if someone was yelling at you or the noise was too loud, or if you couldn't hear something. My response really isn't that different than your response. I just happen to have that response more often than you, right? Okay. So, people often think that those with sensory processing disorder, that there's something wrong with them, right? Well, it's not that there's anything wrong with them. It's they experience the world differently than you, right? And I think just understanding that helps a lot. Just understanding that they experience the world differently, not slower, but differently. And some people, they do process a little slower, but it's not all of it. It's not everybody. The majority of people with sensory processing disorder, with autism, with intellectual disabilities, the majority of them don't process slower, right? Okay. So let's think about art spaces and this hypersensitive continuum. So, as the example I gave is sound. You come into the space, right? It's loud, it reverberates, it's echoey. Even without this microphone, when you talk in this gallery here, the noise is elevated, right? So I'm hypersensitive, and what happens is I hear more echo, or I experience the echo at a much higher intensity than everybody else. And I start to associate all the other parts of this experience. I associate this large space, a high ceiling. I associate the museum space in a very negative way, right? And so I don't want to come to the museums. Even if my mother is making me come to the museum, I don't like it because of the associations and the interactions that I've had coming here. Because I walk into this room and I hear the crowds and I hear the sounds, and all of those sounds are more intense for me and all the other things that I associate with this space, right? It just makes this whole experience negative for me. So museums begin to be negative for me, and I don't want to come here, right? So I don't like these large spaces. I won't enter large spaces. What I may do is I may try to find smaller spaces and quieter spaces in the museum. And that's oftentimes what museum access programs will do, is that they'll try to identify the intensity of these spaces, whether they're more intense or less intense. And my approach is just to provide the information to the person, because I can't change this space, right? I can't change the materials, that it's more concrete and that the sound bounces off of the floor and the walls and the ceiling. I can't change that, right? So just providing that information to people allows them to make choices. And just because I'm hypersensitive to sound, right, doesn't mean there's anything wrong with me. There's some of you who may not like this space either for a variety of reasons, and you start to choose, when you come to the Pushkin Museum, you start to choose your navigation, right? But you have choices. You have information and you have choices, right, to reduce your own anxiety about whatever it is. You know, if you don't like, 18th century Dutch paintings, right, you're going to avoid those galleries. And if you don't like that, that's how you're going to end up navigating through the space, right? But those who have sensory sensitivities, they don't have that information, right? So the museum provides all the information about the gallery spaces, what's in the gallery spaces, but they don't provide information about the sensory environment, right? So the person who has that sensory processing disorder, they don't have the information and they don't have the choice. It's hard for them to make the decisions around how they're going to navigate around the space. So providing that information is really, really helpful. Okay? Now, if they're hyposensitive, right, they're trying to gather information, and, particularly quiet spaces, right, they may not be able to, they may talk loud in quiet spaces because they can't hear what you're saying. So you're in the quieter space, in the gallery, and you're asking, "Mother, what's that?" And everybody looks around like, why is he talking so loud? Even though it's a small space, right? But I'm trying to sort of gather the information. What did you say? What's happening? I don't like that. And they start talking, they may talk a little bit louder in a smaller gallery space. And then everybody else who enters that gallery starts looking at you as the parent or looking at you as the person, and they start thinking, wow, what's wrong with you, right? We actually see this in theater spaces where people are actually asked to leave the theater, even though they've paid for their ticket and they're trying to figure out, what's going on. And they may be talking during the show and they're asked to leave, right? So they're hyposensitive, the sounds are quieter, you're trying to gather information, and so you may talk a lot more, okay? Movement space. So if the chairs weren't here, this is a big open gallery, and I'm trying to get oriented to space, right? If I'm hypersensitive in this big open space, like walking from here all the way over there might be kind of scary for me, right? So what I might do instead was I might just hug the wall and stay really close to the wall instead, because it's a little bit more security that I know I can sort of hold on to something or hold on to the wall. And so I may hug the edge of the wall a little bit more or stay really close to an exhibit, but I actually might get too close to an exhibit, which isn't allowed in a museum, right? So if I'm hypersensitive to gravity, I don't want to move as much. I'm trying to find security in space, right? So you see how the response may not match a museum space, right? If I'm hyposensitive, right, this space actually can look like a really interesting space. There's so much in this gallery room that can be explored to figure out, well, how do I orient myself to this space? And I think these stanchions aren't usually here, right? During regular hours, these stanchions, this is usually open. So if I'm trying to explore space, I may go over and touch David. I might go over and touch those sculptures over there to kind of figure out, well, what's my space orientation here? And even, that piece right there, that rope is naturally there, but I can easily get under that rope to sort of get my space orientation and get really close to that artifact. So if I'm hyposensitive, I'm trying to find security. I'm trying to understand what this whole spatial orientation is about. So I may move around it a lot more, I may touch things more, and that may not be the appropriate response in a museum space. We see this in theater spaces also. Those who are hyposensitive and are trying to figure out their security in space, right? They're fidgety and they're moving around in their theater seat. And again, if you're watching theater, that's not really sort of acceptable behavior, is to sort of fidget around and move around in a theater space. So someone who's hyposensitive, maybe a little bit more hyperactive, may running up and down these stairs over and over and over again until they figure out, oh, there's height, there's steps, there's, and keep on doing it until I feel secure in understanding what this space is all about, right? And so if you were another visitor, and you saw some kids just running up and down these stairs, back and forth, you're gonna look at these kids and say, what's wrong with these kids, right? And right? You've seen kids do that, and they may or may not even have had autism, because those are normal responses, right, in trying to understand space. If you don't understand space, your normal response is to explore it. So if you think about a 4- and 5-year-old kid running up and down these steps, right, doesn't mean that the person has autism. It means the person is trying to understand space, right? Someone with autism may do it a little bit more than other kids, right? But that's sort of what I want to impress upon you, is this sensory processing isn't really different, right? It is a normal response to what they're experiencing. So I have a really wonderful example. It's not really museum-based, but I have a really wonderful example from a theater where this girl was 12 years old, and her mother took her to the opera Hansel and Gretel. And it was an accessible performance. And during the first couple minutes of the show, she was one of those kids who was hyposensitive. She needed to explore space in order to be oriented and to feel safe. So she was sitting down, and her mom kept on saying, sit down, be quiet. Sit down, be quiet, sit down, be quiet. And the staff went up to the mom and explained to the mom, this is an accessible performance. It's okay if she moves around. If that's how she needs to explore the space and experience the show, it's okay. So the young girl, she got up and she moved right up to the edge of the stage. And all she did initially was move back and forth in front of the stage. And she was getting the sense of this space, she was getting a sense of the theater, she was actually even getting a sense of the show, even though she never made visual contact with the performers on the stage. And she kept on moving back and forth. And then at one point in the show, those of us who were watching this realized that whenever the actors moved, she moved. And then when the actors moved back, she moved back. And so she was actually following the show and gathering information about what was going on around her. And then at the point in the Hansel and Gretel opera where they're in the forest and it's nighttime, Hansel and Gretel fall asleep. So this girl is walking back and forth, and at that moment during that scene, she stops. Because it was a quiet moment in the show. And she stops and she sort of centers her body. And we realized that she was completely connected to the show. Even though it didn't look like it because she was just pacing back and forth and she never really made visual contact with the show, but she was connected. And the only way that she was going to be able to be connected to that show is if she moved. If she sat in her chair and her mom kept on telling her, be quiet, sit down, she would have been so focused on the sensations from her body that wanted her to move that she wouldn't have connected to that opera at all. And so she wasn't gaining anything from the experience. But by allowing her to move around and allowing her to gather information from the environment in the way that she gathers information, she was actually able to gather more information and she was able to connect with the opera. So that's a really nice example of sort of meeting people where they are at and not trying to change who they are. They are who they are. Right? I don't know that we know enough about the brain to be sort of saying that if I do this, I'm actually changing the brain. You know, all we're doing is we're accepting them who they are. If she needs to move and that's what she chooses to do, then we're allowing her to do that in an accessible, safe environment. And this example is an example that she made a connection to that opera. Right? So, visual information, right? Someone who is hyposensitive to visual information, they may not be seeing all the variety in the painting, right? And they're not processing all the different pieces of the painting. And they may be going from painting to gather more information rather than focusing just on one painting. They may just be going from painting to painting and looking. And their primary focus may just be colors. It may not be content of the painting, it just may be colors. Because they're just trying to gather information visually so they understand visually what's around them, right? So, you know, going into a gallery space might pose some challenges. So, you know, just creating some simple structure and some simple focus so that they'll stop and look rather than just quickly going from painting to painting because they're trying to gather as much information as they possibly can. Creating simple structure of just, you know, moving through the art gallery can be really helpful. So it's not that you have to do anything really special or really extraordinary. It can be just something as simple as what we call a schedule. You know, following a schedule. You're going to first look at this, and you may give them some indicator of look for the sails in the painting, look for the boats in the painting, and you're just giving them simple cues to help them gather the information that's needed so that they can figure out what the content is of this painting. If they're hypersensitive to information, right, they might actually focus only on the blue piece and get so hyper-focused and look at it closer and closer and closer, right? Because they're gathering more information about the world than everybody else, and they're saying blue. So they're trying to gather blue, and they get closer and closer and closer. So again, you know, it's just creating simple structure and strategies that help people to connect with the content of the information. Now, the other thing that many people make the mistake of is just because someone is hypersensitive in one situation, they think they're hypersensitive for every situation. And that's not true. They can be hypersensitive in one situation and hyposensitive in another situation. They may even be hypersensitive to sound in this context of this gallery space, but be hyposensitive in another gallery, in another space, right? So just because someone is hypersensitive doesn't mean they're hypersensitive all the time. They can fluctuate back and forth, just like you do, right? When I go into the subway or the metro, I'm much more hypersensitive, just in general, because there's so much noise, there's so much crowds and visual stimulation. I'm just much more hypersensitive, right? Particularly in Philadelphia. But when I took the subway in Tokyo, Japan, I was actually very, very relaxed because it's organized, there isn't as much visual stimulation, and I wasn't as hypersensitive, even though it was a different subway system for me. But in my hometown of Philadelphia, it's really noisy, it's really crowded, it's really dirty, and I am much, much more hypersensitive. So it doesn't mean, just because I'm hypersensitive, or I'm hypersensitive to subways in Philadelphia doesn't mean I'm hypersensitive all the time to subways. So I can change and I can modulate differently. The other thing about these experiences is that for many people looking on the outside, because people naturally fluctuate from hyper and hypo, so I'm hypersensitive in this situation, but hyposensitive in that situation, oftentimes people think that, oh, well, he's hypersensitive, but now he's not. He must be faking it, right? And that's where many people in the public think that, oh, I'm trying to get attention, or I'm just a misbehaved kid, because if I'm hypersensitive, I should be hypersensitive all the time. So clearly I must be faking it, right? So, that's important to know that people naturally fluctuate at different times around their sensitivities. The other thing is that, as I explained to you, is these sensations are real, right? I just happen to experience them at a higher intensity than other people. But just like I explained, when there's a loud sound blaring in your ear all the time, what is your natural response? Your natural response is to cover your ears or withdraw from the sound or convey or express something to say the sound is too loud. That's your natural response. So why wouldn't it be my natural response as well, right? You might be able to withdraw from that sound much more easily than someone else, right? And maybe because of whatever situation, I can't withdraw or I can't express it because I may not have the words. So I may start screaming or yelling instead, right? But I'm actually having the same response that you're having, right? So these responses are real, and they're not intended to be attention-seeking or bad behavior. I'm trying to convey something. I'm trying to express something to someone, to let them know that the sound, I don't like the sound. Or if I'm moving around this space more than everybody else, it's just because I don't understand space, and I'm trying to understand space. So I'm going to move around space more than everybody else. Okay? So what are some other things that I do? So my goal is not to change the person. I don't feel I have the expertise to change the brain. So what can I do? I can create an inviting, supportive, and welcoming environment, and I can affect the environment. So as a therapist working in schools, I'm in the classroom, I'm working with a teacher, and we can control everything about that environment. We possibly can. And we get pretty good results from the students because we're controlling all the variables. But the moment that student leaves the school, goes home, or goes out into the community, what parents were telling us were there was those social barriers, but they were also telling us that anything that we taught them in the classroom, it just wasn't carrying over into the community or carrying over into the home. Even though I keep on telling the parent, he's doing so well, he can do this, 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 and this. And the parent's saying, well, that's nice, he does it in the classroom, but he doesn't do it at home. Or he doesn't do it when we go out to the grocery store. And I can't take him to the museum because that's just too scary for many, many reasons. So what can I do? I can't change him, but I can help to create a more inviting environment. And we can affect some of those variables in the environment. We can adapt the environment, we can modify the environment, or we can create new opportunities in the environment. And it's about creating choices for the person. So again, this space might be, from a sound perspective, it might be more intense than other spaces in the museum. If I provide that information to the person, then the person has choice, right? Just like you have choices to navigate through the museum space based on interest or painting interests. The person who has that sensory processing disorder, we're just providing them choice as well. This is a high intense sound area. Down the hallway is a less intense sound area. So I now have the choice to make if I'm someone who is sound sensitive, right? But before that, I didn't have that information, and I don't really have the same choices that everybody else has. So what do you do is you have to assess the environment. And it's not just assessing the sensory environment, the soundscape or the visual intensity. It's not just assessing the sensory or physical space. It's also assessing other things like the dimensions of the space. So those that have that gravitational movement sensation, either hyper or hypo, sort of distance can make a huge, the distance or the location between different spaces can make a difference. Where the bathroom is, where the parking lot is, where the subway or metro station is, did I say bathroom? I know in Europe they say toilets. In America we say bathroom. So where the toilet is, that distance can make a difference, right? If you have that movement sensation, right? If you have to move a lot more to get to a space, right? If it takes you longer to get to a location. So knowing what those space dimensions are is really important. Signs, having clear signs, also can help with some of that predictability. And then obviously doing the soundscape, right? Where are the loud areas? Where are the quiet areas? Looking at visual intensity. Is the space more visually intense than other spaces? Are there more paintings on the wall than in some galleries than other galleries? Even thinking about not just the content of the museum, but other visual information like crowds. When's it more crowded? Versus, it could be more crowded on the week, Saturday or Sunday, versus being crowded on a Tuesday, right? Or is it more crowded in the summer versus the winter? So again, it's not that you can change that because you can't control when people come in and out of the museum, but you can provide people with information that the attendance on Tuesday is less than the attendance on Saturday afternoon, right? Or the attendance is less on Sunday morning than it is on Sunday afternoon. Or the attendance is less in the winter versus the summer. And then you're giving people choices and information so they can determine how they're going to navigate through the museum. Museum spaces are kind of difficult because touching is typically not allowed. But as I explained, for those who may have that movement sensation, who need to touch more pieces to get oriented to space, right? A museum space would be really difficult to navigate through. So having artifacts that are touchable or having reproductions that are touchable helps someone to connect with that museum piece. Without it, then that person's going to have to work really hard at figuring out what are those self-management strategies so I don't touch the statue, right? I mean, like, I want to touch it, but I can't touch it, right? And I want to touch it, but I can't touch it. And I've been at museum spaces with someone who he just had to touch everything, and I tried to walk him through, you can't touch the museum. And he would just, like, I could just tell, he just wanted to touch everything. And he would just, like, everything he could, just to sort of put his hand lightly across everything, just so he kind of understood space. And this is sort of how he just sort of went through the museum, very lightly touching everything. Well, he couldn't do that, right? But if I had something else for him to touch that was connecting him to the museum pieces, he was actually fine. So, again, creating those opportunities. Museum education staff are usually really, really good at creating those tools. Smells. If there's a cafe in the museum, smells might be attractive or aversive. Zoos and aquariums, the hippopotamus smells. The hippopotamus is always going to smell. You can't avoid the hippopotamus from smelling, but you can give the person information, right? And then the person gets to choose. And the person can choose not to go see the hippopotamus, or the person can choose, I want to see the hippopotamus, but I'm very smell sensitive, so what can I do? I can go through the hippopotamus exhibit and cover my nose or do something else, but you're giving the person the choice to decide what they're going to do, rather than you as the zoo or aquarium deciding for that person, right? So just giving information is really, really helpful. Kinesthetic or vestibular experiences, those that need to move to connect with information, that might be their way of understanding a museum content. So at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, we have a movement program that helps those that have this need to move, rather than just running up and down the stairs back and forth to understand space. We actually have a movement program as they go through the museum. So at the Science Museum, there's animals, and so that's kind of easy because we just kind of walk around the museum like animals and we explore all the space, and it's connecting them to the pieces in the museum. But another museum, like the History Museum or the Postage Stamp Museum, that's much more difficult. But we've actually created movement programs around ice cube trays. Or we've made movement programs around postage stamps. And those were actually much more successful than the one around animals, because animals, they kind of got out of control sometimes. But with a postage stamp, like, their focus with the movement, their ability to take more information in and then connect them to this small little postage stamp actually created a lot more focus for them. But because they were moving, they were able to have that visual focus that they wouldn't have had otherwise, because they couldn't figure out how to hone in on the stamp, because their body was telling them, you gotta move, you gotta move, you gotta move. So they just kept on moving and not really focusing on the stamps. So the movement program that we created actually helps them to sort of focus in on, the content of the stamps, and we were able to help them connect in that way. So creating, movement experiences is really helpful. Even in theater spaces, we allow people to move. So there was a performance of the Nutcracker Ballet, and there was a young boy who had that hypersensitivity to gravity, so he wouldn't move that much. And when he moved very, very carefully, very carefully. And we had a movement program with some of the dancers from the ballet company, and they came and they moved with the kids. He still had a lot of difficulty moving, and he was very cautious. But we did this in in his classroom, which was a very different kind of environment. Well, we took the class to go see the Nutcracker, and his teachers who were teaching him, they were on the stage performing. He got up and just stood in the aisle, and he started copying what his teachers were doing on the stage. And he was moving with greater excursion than he would in the class. In the classroom, he would do this. And then when he was in the aisle at the theater with all the other features around him, he started moving his arm with greater range than he would otherwise. And that's another example of allowing people to move if that's how they're gathering information. So we allow him to move during the Nutcracker show, and he stayed totally connected with that experience. Taste, I've never worked on taste, but I'm sure it's possible to do something around taste, but it is something that you need to consider. So in talking about some of these strategies, like allowing people to move, creating a movement program in a museum, allowing the person to move at the Nutcracker. One of the ways that I think about how we create these programs is I break it down into sort of 3 different areas, and I break it down into content, process, and product. So content is, the person is really focused on the knowledge of the experience. What is that piece? What's the information about that piece? And they're just trying to gather as much knowledge as they possibly can, right? In most museums, most theater experiences, they're sort of built around content, passive acquisition of content. So that's okay. And many kids with developmental disabilities, that's how they process. But there are some kids who just having that passive acquisition of content, they need more because they need to move or they need to touch, right? So we create these layered experiences where we have sort of the typical museum experience, but then we have this process experience where the person moves or the person can touch or the person can talk. They can talk in the theater. So we allow this process experience to occur. Another layer that we also add is what we call product-oriented, where the person may need to be actively creating in the art experience, even as they are a visitor in a museum, or if they are watching a show at a theater. So they have to be actually actively creating at the same time. Like the boy watching the Nutcracker, he had to dance at the same time in order to sort of connect and understand what was happening. Or it may mean we create stations within the museum, and we have art building activities that are connected to the pieces that are being exhibited on the walls as well. And so we create these stations throughout the museum so that those that are more product-oriented and need that movement or tactile sensation in order to connect with the exhibit, that they have those opportunities. So we actually build all these layers in at the same time because we never know how the person is going to, how they're going to present at that moment. And as I said, that hyper and hypo can fluctuate at different times, depending on different conditions. So a person may come to the same gallery one day and be hypersensitive, and they may come to the gallery on another day and be hyposensitive. So sometimes it's not about trying to predict what the person's going to be, but it's about trying to allow for all those opportunities and keeping those opportunities available so that the person has the choice to make when they enter that space, whether it's a museum or a theater. So that's sort of thinking about the sensory and the physical landscape. And I also talked earlier about one of the biggest barriers was really social attitude. And that actually is probably the biggest barrier that most families talk to us about, is that it's the social barrier that's the biggest problem. And it really is about the public not understanding who we are as a family or how I am as a person. And so staff training is really important. Public education is really important. And not necessarily public education just to the target audience, the community of people who have autism, but to everybody in the public. Because the goal of this is hopefully beginning to fundamentally change society so that we can accept everybody for who they are and not sort of make everybody fit it into our particular molds of what things should be. So providing that public education is really, really important. And you can provide that public education in a variety of ways. In the Washington area, in the United States, we do television, we do newspapers, we do radio, we do the regular social medias, but we do it all the time. We don't just do the public education when there's an event or when something happens. We have this regular cycle of always getting in the news, getting in the newspaper, getting on the radio, so that the public is constantly hearing that the Smithsonian Institution, the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, we value and believe in accessibility, diversity, and inclusion. And so the public is constantly hearing this. So it's a typical marketing strategy. The more you hear about it, the more you're going to understand it. Right? It's just like Coca-Cola. You see it everywhere all the time, no matter where you go. So when someone asks you for a beverage, one of your first thoughts is Coca-Cola, right? You may like Pepsi, but somehow the words Coca-Cola come out of your mouth more often than Pepsi, right? Because Coca-Cola just has a really good marketing tool. So it's sort of the same idea, is just publicly disseminating about accessibility, diversity, and inclusion as much as you possibly can. And that begins to change the way people view other people, whether the person has a disability or not. But it also tells the public that if you enter the Smithsonian Institution, or if you enter the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, that as an organization, we believe in inclusion, we believe in diversity, we believe in accessibility, and so we're going to have a variety of responses from people in our museum space. And because this is what we believe as an organization, as a public member, you're welcome to come here, but we're going to support everybody in their experience here at the museum. And we're not going to allow other people to ridicule or discriminate against other people. And so that message is constantly being sent out there from those organizations. So again, it's about creating these diverse opportunities and choices and allowing the person with a disability to self-determine how they're going to experience the museum, rather than the museum deciding how they're going to experience the museum. Of course, there are some basic rules, like you can't touch important artifacts, but you do want to create as much choice as you possibly can. And that's really helpful. When you do training, you train everybody, not just the museum educators, but you train security, you train people in the gift shop, you train people who even clean the museum, because they're going to be around in the environment. And you want to make sure that if they encounter somebody whose response might be different than what they're expecting, that they understand why their response is different, and then they're going to approach the situation differently, rather than it's always in an emergency because someone is touching an exhibit, right? You would have a different skill in how you go up to the person in telling them to not touch pieces. We also, because some of the work that we do is also around art making, around going to dance class, going to theater class, going to art classes, that we also do lots of trainings with artists as well. Art teachers, dancers, actors, we do a lot of training with them also, because it's not just about a visitor experience, that the way that we frame it, that it's the arts industry, and that visitor experience is just one part of the art experience, that there is also art making, and then there's also arts organization, and within an arts organization, there are multiple roles that people take that are paid or unpaid, whether you're a volunteer. But people with disabilities can also fulfill those roles as well, but we have to give them the opportunity to do that. So we train everybody up and down the entire venue. Look at visitor patterns. I already talked about that. One of the things, I already talked about visitor patterns on particular days or seasons. The other thing that we learned in Washington is, if you've been to Washington, the Smithsonian Institution is on this big giant mall. And there's about 7 museums in that area. But there's these big giant streets, and oftentimes there's parades, there's marathon races, and sometimes we're scheduling activities on the same day as the marathon race, and then they block all the streets off. So it just makes it that much more difficult to get to the museum. So we also, when we are planning things, we also make sure that we are looking at community calendars from other activities and events throughout the city. So we are trying to make it as barrier-free for the family as we possibly can. Another issue is transportation, and actually transportation seems to be one of the biggest barriers for families to get to the theater or the museum, whether the person uses a private car or whether the person uses public transportation. And particularly around public transportation, it may be difficult because you can't control when the trains are coming, if they're on time. You can't control the sounds or the noise from the subway. So families have told us that oftentimes the transportation is the biggest challenge, more than anything. So in Philadelphia, our public transportation agency has hired specialists to really examine that issue around disability and accessibility. I think it's a really interesting change in perspective for the transportation agency that they hired accessibility specialists. So it's something to really consider. At least in the United States and the families that I work with, they're constantly telling me that transportation is one of the biggest issues. So the museum can create this wonderful, wonderful program, but if people aren't coming because they can't get there, or there's so many barriers that it takes to get there, then they're not going to come. And so that leads us to this idea of the journey of the families. So the family leaves their home, they take some transportation mode, whether it's a car or public transportation. They get to the event, the museum program or accommodated theater show, and then they either have the choice of rushing back home, or what I often do after I go to the museum or after I see a show is I like to sit with my friends or my family who I went to the show with and talk about the museum or talk about the theater show. So I might go to a cafe, or I might go to a restaurant. Or if it's in a busy shopping area, I might do some shopping or window shopping. I might do other things, and that seems pretty normal for families when they go out into the community. It's a whole string of activities. It's not just going to the event and coming home. Right? Sometimes it is, but other times it's going to the event, connecting other activities together, and then going home. For families who have a child with disability, these are often not choices for them. Going to a restaurant or a cafe or going shopping is not a choice for them. So in some cities around the United States, there's been an effort to do trainings and education with other places on that journey, like restaurants. So in New York, on Broadway, the group that is developing accessible programs on Broadway, they've tried to educate restaurants around Broadway so that families have the choice to go to restaurants after the show and talk about the show and relax. Also trying to train stores as well. So it's about this whole journey. It's not just about the specific event at the museum only. And that's where I think creating these partnership teams with people within the institution as well as people outside the institution is really important. And that's the model that we try to use in Philadelphia, in Washington, in Pittsburgh, in New York. That's the model that's we're trying to develop, is that it's not just about the event itself. If you really talk to the families are telling us that they want a community experience. And the community experience means this whole journey through the community. So, what's the evidence on the type of programming, accessible programming in museums and performing arts centers? There isn't a lot, unfortunately. I've been doing this work for about 10 to 15 years. There's others who have been doing this work as well, but there just isn't a lot of research done on this. And some of the data that I've collected is really, it's really about expectations that the person has, and then the response to their own expectations. And we do it through surveys and interviews. We thought we would try to do some direct behavioral observations, but that just didn't work because the people with disabilities said they don't want to be watched. They don't want to feel like they're a lab rat, that somebody is watching them at every move that they're making as they go out into the community. But we've collected a little bit over 400 data points, and we've collected it from different cities around the United States, and we've collected it within visual arts and performing arts. And what did we find? And what we found was that people with disabilities were telling us there were 3 factors that they felt were really important for them to feel safe in the environment. And one was addressing the soundscape. And again, it's not necessarily about lowering the sounds, because oftentimes you can't lower the sounds. This gallery space, you can't lower the sounds. In a theater, you can't necessarily lower the sounds. But it's providing the information to the person and making sure they know all the different options that are available to them so that they can make the choice. So if the person is sound sensitive, they can wear headphones that sort of soften the sound a little bit, right? So it's giving them those choices. Or it's letting them know that there's quieter spaces within the museum, right? Or even at a concert hall, that depending on where you're sitting in the concert hall, the sounds might be a little bit less intense. So if you're sitting, in the first row at the concert hall, of course the sound's going to be more intense than if you're sitting in the very last row of the concert hall, or if you're sitting up in the balcony, the sound might be a little bit less intense. But it's allowing families, or giving the information to the person, and then allowing families to make those choices. So within a concert experience, we let people move and change their seats as many times as they want, and that's perfectly fine. And the concert hall has prepared for that fluid variation of seating, that people at the beginning of the concert, they may sit closer to the stage, and during the middle of the concert, they may move back further in the concert hall. And so the organization has made arrangements to make sure that not every seat is sold out, and that people have space to move back and forth. We've also, in theater spaces, we've also allowed people to stand at the doorway and watch the show or listen to the concert rather than going all the way into the hall, because that's too intense for them. to be in the hall with the high ceiling and all the sound coming at them, but they stand at the doorway and they just watch the concert or the show from the doorway. And we've had people who stood at the doorway for 45 minutes and watched the entire show, but the point is they watched the entire show rather than leaving the theater or leaving the concert. So they were connected to the experience. Lights, modifying lights was also an important feature that people were telling us, that if they were light sensitive, that intense lights were a little bit lower, and sometimes that's possible in the theater. In museum spaces, sometimes that's not even possible, but again, it's about giving them information so that they can make the choices themselves and how they navigate through the space. Now, the third most important thing, or actually it's not even the third most important, it actually is the number one important thing that families and people with disabilities have told us. The number one important thing is that the social environment is different. And that's where the public education and the staff training comes in. And when the staff are fully trained and every person that walks through the door of that theater or of that museum space and knows that there's going to be diversity of people in this experience, that everybody has a different attitude in that experience. And the person with a disability actually feels that and knows that. And they said that's the most important thing, is that people are inviting and welcoming and tolerant and accepting of who they are. And they said that more than anything, more so than even the sound and the lights, the change in the social environment was the most important thing to them, which made them feel more comfortable to come out in the community more and more often. The problem is there aren't enough places in the community that have this inviting space. So there's other things that we do, like we provide sensory maps that really explain where the quiet spaces are and the more intense spaces are. We also provide them with information around, what are the attendance records. We also, tell them that, the hippopotamus is smelly. We give them all this information. We call that priming materials. And with our data, we haven't been able to show that as a whole disability community, that those strategies in and of itself are making a huge difference for the whole community, right? The light, sound, and social environment seem to be affecting the whole community. But these other little strategies that we're using, we can't identify a significant shift from what they're expecting to what they're experiencing, and that it makes their visit a little bit easier. But as we began to analyze this more and more, we actually thought or think that that's actually a really good thing, because everybody experiences the sensations differently, right? Everybody experiences things differently. And for those who need that information, it's really important. There's other people who don't need the information, and it's perfectly fine. But if you don't provide that information, then you're excluding all the people over here. So it's always providing the information as much as you possibly can, so that the person can sort of get understand the whole experience and then begin to make their own choices. So even though we haven't, in our research, we haven't been able to show some of these other strategies are having some overall population effect, we don't get rid of them, because we know it's a smaller cohort of people that say they need this, right? It's just that the whole population that we study are saying that, not all of us need it, but there is a small group of people that say they need it, and so we still have to make sure that we have it available for them. And these results that we've gotten, we've been able to repeat it in Philadelphia, in Washington, in Minneapolis, in very different cities. And we've also been able to see the exact same effect, whether we're looking at a music experience, a visual arts experience, a dance experience. It comes back fairly consistently identical every single time. So here are some quotes from individuals with disabilities and families. So here at the aquarium, we created those multi-layers of experience, content, process, and product. And the mom said, I don't think my son would touch the animals. And he went through the entire museum touching everything. And the mom discovered something about her son that she didn't even know before. And he even discovered something about himself because he had never been exposed to going to the aquarium before. So now he goes to the aquarium all the time. And so he has a whole new experience in his world. Another parent said, my dream was that I could take all my children, and this year my dream came true. And this was going to the Nutcracker Ballet. And so these are really important family aspirations that families have that they aren't able to live. So as a parent, think about if you can't fulfill a dream with your whole family, right? And this is what parents are telling us that they're experiencing. I had to show her what I loved about the world, and going to the theater is something I love. So imagine you not being able to share the things that you love about the world with your children, right? And these opportunities that are being created, these accessible programs that are being created are really changing family dynamics in the decisions that they're making, in what they're choosing to do as a family. And we're seeing this over and over again. The other thing that we've seen is parents are telling us when they go out into the community, when they go to an accessible program at the museum, that they're much more relaxed, that they aren't anxious, they aren't nervous, and they're enjoying the experience with their children. They're also saying that they're actually having what we've called whole family experiences. So in the past, the families were saying that the person, their family member who has a disability would stay home with an older sibling or a parent. And then the rest of the family would go out. They'd go to the zoo or the park or some other community experience. So families are saying at these accessible programs, they're now going out as an entire family. And they had never experienced that before. And so families, I remember after the first time at the Nutcracker, families were walking out of the theater in tears, and we thought, oh, so you had a really happy experience. It wasn't the Nutcracker. What they were telling us was the experience was we were together. So imagine not being able to do things together as a whole family, right? And that's what families were telling us. That's why they were crying. Not because they came to the Nutcracker. It was because that they came as a whole family. And then for particularly youth and young adults who have autism and intellectual disabilities, this quote right here, I get to be who I am. That exact quote keeps on popping up in many, many interviews where the person actually says, I get to be who I am. And so we started thinking about why is this exact quote popping up word for word with our interviews? And we started thinking, wow, so they really feel like they don't get to be who they are whenever they leave the house. They have to try and be something different, or they can't be comfortable in who they are. So imagine you not being who you are when you go out into the community. And these accessible programs are allowing people to be who they are. And I think that's a really powerful sense of identity. And people with disabilities oftentimes don't have that sense of identity, and that's really important. And that's what we've seen from the accessible art programs that we've created. One of the challenges right now in the United States and even in the UK is that most of these accessible programs have been created for children and youth. I've been doing this work for almost 15 years now. So the kids that I had worked with 10, 15 years ago, they're all 20 years old now. And they're back sort of in the same place. They don't have all the same choices that they had. You know, the when these people were children and we created all these family programs, the families had lots of choices and lots of opportunities. But now that these children are adults and are trying to make decisions on their own, they no longer have the opportunities again because the programs that I've developed and the programs that many of these organizations have developed, they just weren't oriented for older people. So that's a challenge right now in the work in the United States and in the UK, is that we need to now continue to expand and develop the programming that extends these experiences all the way through adulthood. And that's what we haven't done yet. So there are many organizations that are actually beginning to do that and really creating opportunities for adults and even for older youth and for young adults. We've even had experiences where we tackle some pretty sensitive topics. So this is a play that was created in the United States, and it's about rape and violence. It has a very wonderful ending, but through the show, there is rape and violence through the show. And at first, the organization felt we shouldn't do this because that topic is too sensitive. And as we talked about it, in the United States, people with developmental disabilities actually are at risk for abuse and violence. And where are they actually where do they learn about this? And who's teaching it to them? And while there are many really wonderful teachers out there that are doing this work, and there's many wonderful parents out there doing this work, we're just creating another layer and another doorway for us to have this conversation. And theater is it's a nice way to begin that conversation because it can be looked at rather than experienced directly. And so you can begin that conversation. So, we tell organizations don't shy away from intense topics because it's important to, again, experience the entire world. Let them choose about how they think about violence rather than me deciding for them how they're supposed to think about violence, right? So we encourage organizations to really begin tackling sensitive topics as they begin to develop adult programming. The other interesting thing that we've seen is that the programs we've developed, the strategies that we use in these programs, those who work with older adults with dementia are actually starting to employ the same strategies. It's not my area of work, and I don't necessarily know the impacts that it's having, but I am hearing from colleagues who work with older adults with dementia that they're employing very similar strategies around sensory environments, around preparing and making sure that there's information available so the person who does have dementia still has choices to make and that we're not making the choices for them. So arts accessibility is more than access. Access just opens the door, but it's then creating the meaningful participation, the connecting with other people, and creating the layers of experience that really allows people to engage with the museum and engage with performing arts. And hopefully, as we do this more and more, that we will begin to start developing more inclusive society and begin to fundamentally change how people view other people. And that was my talk. So thank you.
Большое спасибо, Роджер. Я хотела бы сказать большое спасибо за такое огромное количество интересных вопросов, о которых нам предстоит еще подумать. Я хочу сказать, что мы уже подумали, например, о подготовке, о вопросе выбора, потому что в нашем музее, например, я приглашаю всех скачать карту сенсорной безопасности, которую мы разработали для главного здания издания «Галерея», и хотя бы в этом плане мы готовы к тому, чтобы предоставить выбор нашим посетителям, куда конкретно они хотят прийти. Я бы также хотела сказать большое спасибо фонду «Абсолют-Помощь», благодаря которому развивается программа «Доступный музей» в Пушкинском музее. И у нас есть буквально несколько минут для ваших вопросов. Кто хочет задать вопрос?
Здравствуйте, спасибо большое за ваше выступление. У меня два вопроса. Первый вопрос. Предоставление информации хорошо работает, когда мы говорим об индивидуальных посетителях и когда мы говорим о семьях. Но мы очень часто сталкиваемся с ситуацией, когда у нас к нам приходит класс из школы, который может полностью состоять из детей с аутизмом. Или к нам приходит какой-то коллектив, уже сложившийся, например, от какого-то фонда. И в этой группе мы имеем людей с совершенно разным восприятием, совершенно разными потребностями. И понятно, что да, мы должны создать вот этот многослойный опыт, где для каждого человека найдется какое-то занятие. Но при этом люди, которые к нам приходят, мы можем столкнуться с такой проблемой, что один из них, например, будет очень долго трогать, а другому нужно уже бежать срочно в следующий зал. И вот первый вопрос — это как работать с группой, в которой очень разнородные люди. Это вопрос номер один. Вопрос номер два, секунда, это по поводу объектов, которые можно трогать в экспозиции. Я изначально работаю в основном с незрячими посетителями, поэтому я всегда хочу, чтобы можно было как можно больше всего потрогать в музее. Но многие музеи, по крайней мере в России, говорят, что мы боимся ставить тактильные объекты внутри экспозиции, потому что это побудит людей больше трогать сами экспонаты. То есть, может быть, существуют какие-то исследования, которые как-то замеряют, больше трогают или меньше трогают, если есть тактильные экспонаты?
So the touchable exhibit, I'm going to actually allow Evgenia to respond to that. As far as the classroom experience, so what we've actually done with the classroom experience is we actually do a lot of outreach at the program or the school beforehand. So we start building their repertoire of knowledge a month or 2 months ahead of time. And we are going to the school, we are working with the teachers, so we're actually beginning to train the teachers on what the content is, and then we begin to start identifying the different variations of how people are responding to certain content, and we begin to start building that in the classroom or in the program that the group is from. And that's what we've been doing, and it's worked out okay. And we start to actually introduce them to the structure of a social experience, that we're going to go to this exhibit first, and we're going to have these other layers of experience here, and then we're going to move on to the next one, and we have multiple layers there. So if we create the multiple layers in this exhibit, we're creating a doorway for everybody so they don't start running around trying to find their own interest points. And that's what we've done in the United States, and it's worked okay for us. Yeah. Touchables?
And the second question, would you say something for the second question?
Is about creating more touchable experiences in museums. I mean, for the individuals with autism that we work with, we're actually relying on museum educators who've done a lot of work with the blind, because we're finding the strategies that they use are really helping us with touchable experiences. What are the touchable artifacts, as well as creating touchable replications.
Проблема не в том, как создать объекты, проблема не в том, как сделать объекты, которые можно трогать, а проблема именно в том, что администрация музея, музейные руководители боятся, что если я вот здесь рядом с Давидом поставлю кусок мрамора, который можно будет трогать, то после того, как человек потрогает кусок мрамора, он пойдет трогать Давида. И что если мы делаем тактильные объекты внутри экспозиции, то люди думают, что значит все можно трогать.
Everything is, yeah. I am going to punt this one to Evgenia.
На первый вопрос я могу сказать, что у нас найдено только одно решение. Мы делаем очень маленькие группы для того, чтобы вот этот разрыв между различными потребностями детей был не таким большим. И относительно второго, мы делаем тактильные копии работ, ставим их в экспозицию. Это вызывает вопросы не только у российских хранителей, это вызывает вопросы у хранителей со всего мира. Только что мы готовили выставку лондонской школы и очень долго с музеем Тейт дискутировали, что это за копии будут размещены в одном пространстве рядом с оригиналами. То есть это абсолютно нормальный диалог, который сопровождает, в принципе, разные аспекты подготовки выставки. Мы разрешаем трогать тактильные копии всем, не только людям с проблемами зрения, но также людям без особенностей развития и без каких-либо других особенностей.
Another way, and again, we're learning a lot from those who work with the blind, but another way possibly to think about it is, creating those layers of content, process, and product. So it doesn't always have to be the exact replica of this, like just providing clay or some clay-like product that they can sort of manipulate and get a sense of shape and sometimes that's enough, so it's not like the exact replica, so they start thinking like you were saying, oh, I can just touch everything, but they need that touch experience in order to stay focused. So it doesn't always have to be an exact replica as well. So again, my experience working with the large bringing, classroom is we actually make sure we have those layers available, whenever we're at an exhibit. So we have more of a content-oriented experience, a process experience, and a product experience. And so then the kids can kind of choose how they're interacting with that particular piece. So it might be one way to think about as well.
Я бы хотела еще добавить, что я принимала участие в тактильной программе музея Метрополитен, где можно было познакомиться на ощупь с оригинальными произведениями искусства древнейших эпох. И это вызывало огромное количество вопросов у всех остальных посетителей музея Метрополитен в этот день. Они подходили и спрашивали, мы тоже хотим потрогать, пожалуйста. И это вопрос сотрудничества, о котором говорил сейчас Роджер, что это вопрос подготовки сотрудников музея, потому что с абсолютно дружелюбным подходом им давали исчерпывающие ответы, почему нельзя сейчас, к сожалению, потрогать вот эту статую, и что это специальная группа и так далее. Есть ли какие-то еще вопросы? У нас есть буквально несколько минут. Спасибо большое. Это была программа «Доступный музей». Подписывайтесь на видео «Пушкинский для всех».